Hello, I'm Marcus Bointon. I'm here to tell you about being at the wrong end of a security hole. I'm the technical director of Syncromedia Limited. It's a small UK company, and I maintain a mailing list management system called smartmessages.net, and that uses PHPMailer, and I am the maintainer of PHPMailer, which is used by like the entire web, which is something of a problem in itself, as you'll see. So, back in December, I got a notification on GitHub. And it looked like this. How many of you are project maintainers? Oh, not that many. Okay, if you're the maintainer of a project, a public open source project, this is the kind of thing that you sort of dread. Is you get kind of quite attached to your projects, and it sort of feels like your baby. And a message like this gives you a kind of sinking feeling. It's like getting a call from your child's school saying that they've hurt themselves, you know, or you find out they've beaten up some other kid or something. Something bad is pending. Obviously, sometimes you get these things and they're false alarms, but this particular one wasn't. So how did I get into the situation where I was maintaining this package and ended up being the one responsible for dealing with this? Well, just a bit of a history here. PHPMailer started out on SourceForge way back in 2001, which is several thousand years in code. I first used it in 2003 and ended up being becoming a reasonably significant contributor to it, though I never got to the point where I was like a project admin or the owner. Then what happened is the people that were controlling the project at the time handed it over to somebody else who hadn't really been involved with the project at all. And I was a little bit annoyed about that because I'd put in a reasonable amount of effort and so on. I felt a bit hard done by there. So I decided to try and I hated SourceForge. I mean, SourceForge has never been very nice to work with, and it was all in Subversion and so on. So there was this new web service that looked really cool, and I thought I'd try it out. And it was called GitHub. So I made a fork of PHPMailer on GitHub. And the project owner at the time, again, even though I then had an ongoing relationship with him and the development of the system, he then took a unilateral decision and handed the whole project over to Apache. And it went into their kind of incubator program. Apache moved it to Google Code, which is, as we all know, where code goes to die. And we know what happened to Google Code. But the way that Apache handled the project, I was really uncomfortable with. For a start, they dropped the entire commit history of the project, which is something you really don't do with open source projects. You know, everybody has contributed to this, and it's an important part of where a project is to maintain this ongoing history, partly so that you can blame people when it goes wrong later. So the other thing is that they didn't do any of their development in public. Despite the fact that there was a Git repo there, they didn't really use it. All that happened is that they did their development internally, and every now and again a tarball would turn up, kind of unannounced. And so what happened then is I started spotting these tarballs and started pulling them back into my own GitHub project. And merging them in with all the changes. So I was trying to maintain the whole project history and so on. And then because the official pointers and the top Google hits were still pointing at the Apache copy, a lot of bug reports were appearing on Google Code, but they weren't really being handled. So what I started doing then was fixing them in my own fork and reporting them back on Google Code. And this was kind of a slightly passive-aggressive thing to do, but the project maintainers didn't really seem to be on top of things there. Now, eventually they kind of gave in and said, okay, we agree with you, you can take over and deal with it. So I then ended up in control of the project, but it was still in my own Synchro branch on GitHub, my fork. So I thought it would be better to move it into a GitHub organization. So I did that in 2013, and that's where it's been ever since. And it's still been massively popular as of this morning, we've just got over 9,000 stars and a shade under 5,000 forks. So it's one of the kind of top 10 projects on GitHub and PHP, and it's used all over the place. And Google Code itself, of course, died, presumably because it hosted itself. And so this is where we're left today. PHPMailer is just massively popular. Although it's ancient, it's just still used in an awful lot of places, and it's not really showing any particular signs of decline. This blue line here from Google Trends, you can see this is for 5 years, and you can see that every year there's a little dip. And basically that's Christmas. Christmas, every year we get a little dip. Apart from this year, something different happened. The red line there is SwiftMailer, and the bottom line is ZendMail, just for comparison. Show that things are really in a pretty steady state. Nothing's really changing very much. We've got 3 million pulls from Packagist, and these stats are from this morning. Nearly 5,000 forks. Anyway, so yeah, right. When you have a security vulnerability, you hope that it goes through a process known as responsible disclosure. So, and the basic pattern behind this is that somebody, usually a security researcher, you hope, and not some black hat hacker, someone finds a vulnerability in a bit of code or a service or hardware or whatever it is, and they report it confidentially to the vendor or maintainer of that software. And the vendor then develops some mitigation or a patch to address this vulnerability. And typically they're given about 90 days in order to actually address this before they go public. The patch is then released, and then the vulnerability is disclosed. However, things don't always go according to plan, and there's an assumption here that nobody else finds the vulnerability. When that goes wrong and information about the vulnerability is released before there are patches available, this is known as a zero-day disclosure, a zero-day vulnerability. And these are coveted by black hat hackers and security services. If you're the NSA, you hoard them rather than actually getting them fixed, which isn't really very good for anybody, as all the recent ransomware has witnessed. So when you get some vulnerability like this, because there are lots and lots of these things, and people need to have something to refer to them by, there's a system known as CVE, which is the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures number. And the idea here is that you just have this single reference, so you can point that this particular way of attacking this particular software or service, we're going to call this number. So everybody can be referring to the same thing, and there's no confusion, especially because very often you get very slightly different attacks on the same thing, and so they all get different numbers just to make sure they're talking about the same exact vulnerability. So this common reference just provides common ground. Now, the whole CVE system is operated by an American company called the MITRE Corporation, which is funded by the US government through the Department of Homeland Security. You can go and visit their site at cve.mitre.org, and there you can go and request a new CVE number. Now, this takes a few days, usually, and you don't have to disclose anything about the vulnerability itself. You just have to say what it's relating to. There's not much detail involved. You can just say, I'm going to need a number for this. And in fact, a lot of the larger companies like Microsoft and so on will actually sort of apply for batches of numbers in advance so that when they need one, they've got one available. They don't have to wait for one because they know they're going to get through them. There's no avoiding it. As well as getting new numbers, you can also search for existing ones and find lots of information. The same information is also available from the National Vulnerability Database, which is run by NIST. Again, an American service, but it's really easy to go there and find out exactly, when you see a CVE number, to find out what it is, what it means, how it was patched, and so on. So PHPMailer got assigned these two numbers, CVE 2016, which gives you the year, and the number of the vulnerability for the year. It was in December, so these got to pretty big numbers, and I think actually the last 2 years is the first time they've actually needed 5 digits. So the numbers have been getting pretty big. So we've got two numbers here. You'll see why. As well as just having a number, the CVE information contains information, well, once it's complete, contains information about what kind of thing the vulnerability is and how bad it is, its possible consequences. So common types, remote code executions, SQL injections, cross-site scripting, denial of service, and there are lots of others like directory traversal, file inclusion, information disclosure, privilege escalation. There are lots of different ways that software and services can go horribly wrong. But this type doesn't necessarily tell you how bad it is. It's possible to have SQL injections that are entirely harmless, or they might be totally catastrophic, so that there's a large range of impacts to these things. So you really need both things. You need the type and the severity. And the severity is scored according to a system called CVSS. And this is quite a complicated series of gaining and losing points for various aspects of the vulnerability. So you get a number out of it at the end, but also you get this straightforward rating of critical, high, medium, and low. So PHPMailer's 2 CVEs were both rated as 9.8 critical, which is pretty bad. So what was the actual issue? Okay, well, here's a piece of code which is actually vulnerable. Now, the thing to pay attention to really is the set from call there, which is what you use to set the from address of the message. Now that in itself isn't a problem. There's nothing wrong with setting a from address. What's important here is that by default, PHPMailer uses the mail function in PHP, so it acts like a big wrapper around the mail function. The thing about the mail function is it's very, very basic. It doesn't really do anything. It says, here's a fully, you just pass it a fully constructed RFC822 message and who it's going to and a couple of other parameters. And then there's this option to have additional parameters on the end, which are things that are ultimately passed through to a shell to call to a sendmail binary. And that's actually where the problem lies. Now, very often, especially if you're doing this on any kind of scale, you want to set the SMTP envelope, the outer wrapper of the message, to have a sender address that's different from the from address. And that's typically for doing things like something called VERP addressing. And that's used to give you much better control over the bounces that happen on messages, because you can have very fine control and embed additional information in the address that stuff will get sent back to if it gets bounced. Because there are quite a few badly behaved mail servers in the world, and for example, I've commonly seen Microsoft Exchange send bounces that don't actually include the email address that bounced. So if you're not using VERP addressing, it's actually not possible to tell what address bounced, which is completely stupid. But VERP addressing to the rescue, it means that you do get that information back in your return path. So fundamentally, we've got this injection of this user-supplied email address, and so the automatic response here is, well, you should. Actually, there's a problem with doing this anyway. If you set the from address from something that was submitted by the user, the chances are that this is going to be sent from your server, which very probably isn't set as a SPF source in their own domain's DNS. And so that means that you're probably not going to be able to even deliver this message, even if it does work, because it will just get either rejected or put into a spam folder at the very least at the receiving end. So all the documentation tells you not to do this, so that's one aspect. You should always send to yourself and do a reply to using the submitter's address. So ultimately, then, having got this, your reaction is immediately, but you should always make sure that you filter and validate this address before you use it. Well, we do. We validate everything extremely thoroughly, but it doesn't help at all in this case. And you'll see why. Right, the actual problem down in the depths of the code is that if we don't set a sender address explicitly, it uses the from address instead. So that from address that was supplied in there is going to be copied and used as the sender property in the SMTP envelope. And this is used to construct a string, which is passed as the fifth parameter on the mail function, which is the additional parameters thing. And it's just a string that gets tacked onto the end of the call to the sendmail binary. That's ultimately what the mail function calls through a shell. So inside the code, we've got this sender value. We put it after the -f option, which is going to set the envelope sender, and that gets set. So the fundamental issue is that a valid email address can also be a fully functioning attack string. That in itself might be a bit of a surprise to some people, but that's how it is. It all comes down to context. There are plenty of things that are lethal in a shell but harmless in SQL, and vice versa. There are plenty of other similar situations. It's all about the context. So of course, what we want to do there is to escape it, right? So we do this. So we've got exactly the same thing, and we know it's a shell argument, so we use escape shell arg and pass in the same value in the same way. Now, around the time when we were thinking about this as the solution, somebody posted an exploit on a public mailing list. So before we'd had a chance to release anything, we had become a zero-day vulnerability. This was really unhelpful, and it's really quite stressful. And this was a couple of days before Christmas. Yes. But anyway, so we rushed out this fix as PHPMailer 5.2.18, which also became known as CVE 2016 10045. So what were we doing wrong here? Well, this is what we think we're doing. So fundamentally, inside mail, there's a mail command, and we're escaping this thing that gets tacked onto the end. However, if you read the mail documentation, the mail function documentation in PHP carefully, you find that it does this. It applies escape shell command to the call to the send mail binary, but it includes the additional parameters inside the escape shell command. So actually what we're doing is this. And there's a problem with that. You think, well, you're escaping everything. But the problem is you've got escaping inside escaping, and if you do escaping inside escaping, you can end up unescaping. And unfortunately, the result of this is actually undefined and exploitable. Mainly because the mail function doesn't take into account the locale of the shell that you're running within. And the problem is that because there are all sorts of weird characters that are perfectly valid in an email address, those same characters, depending on the locale, can also be escape strings in the locale. But because you've got no idea what the mail function is going to use for its locale, you are basically defenseless. You can't control that. There are some locales that use plus as an escape character. There may even be some that use @ This is a problem for an email address, obviously. So we worked out a patch for this, and essentially what that patch did is pay particular attention to the sender value and refuse to use it if it contained anything that might possibly need escaping. So essentially we restricted email addresses severely to just being basically letters, numbers, dot, and @ and maybe hyphen. So we really restricted them, rather than the massive array of complex addresses that are actually allowed by the RFCs. We limited it to a much smaller subset. And fundamentally, this is really actually a bug in the mail function, but it's one that's actually really quite difficult for them to work around, which is why it's still there. So that was kind of that. The patches were done and released. And the process of actually getting to that point was involved people helping me doing it. I wasn't left entirely to myself. The thing is, as soon as you get any kind of public vulnerability like that, security researchers in particular just all jump on it because they're all interested in this stuff. And then in many ways, they're kind of competing with each other because it's a kind of a competition to see who can find the most vulnerabilities and get the most points on HackerOne and whatever. The security researcher who reported it was really helpful. He helped with reviewing the solutions and verifying that they had actually mitigated stuff. Though the problem is that because we had to rush out the first patch because of the public the 0-day aspect of it, that one kind of slipped through. But he then helped calm things down a bit, and we got the second patch out. But other researchers turned up to help. And as you probably gathered, some of these problems with the escaping things in shells, with locales and things, this is reasonably specialist knowledge, and it wasn't really something that I was aware of at all. So having people turning up to help doing these kind of things. And the other thing which was great about it is that these were not the usual contributors to PHPMailer. These were people that were completely outside the project that just turned up specifically for this. So that was really great, having people that actually knew what they were doing, turning up and helping, doing stuff that actually really helped and mattered. There were also things that were not really so helpful. After the patches were released, we got quite a flurry of issues turning up on GitHub, going like, did you know there's this security hole in PHPMailer? And often doing things like giving us links back to our own release notes. It's like, well, weirdly, yeah. I had lots of friends going, hey, isn't this you? I go, yes. So we also got a fair amount of press and exposure because this was a big deal. You know, there are literally like possibly hundreds of millions of websites that are actually that have PHPMailer embedded in them in one place or another, because it's bundled in WordPress and many WordPress plugins separately as well. And often they have old versions, and you get like different bundled versions, and they call them in weird ways and do stuff the documentation tells them not to, but you can't really help that. So there are millions of sites potentially affected by this. We got quite a lot of articles published. Security Week, Hacker News, Register. Register is always great for things like that. But I was particularly pleased getting into the SANS newsletter, because that's a pretty significant thing. It's a really great thing to subscribe to. That they provide us every week. They give maybe about sort of 10 or so of the week's sort of security vulnerabilities as just a quick one-paragraph summary of it, and then they have little critiques of the attack and the solutions and the reactions from maintainers and vendors by some really well-respected names in security. So it's a really good thing to read, because it's really short and to the point. Quite a lot of them misreported it as an input validation error, which, as we've seen, wasn't really the case. There was nothing wrong with the validation, it was all fine. The problem was that valid thing in a different context was not safe at all. And being PHP, we got the usual PHP abuse. But generally, the comments I had on handling the vulnerability and how we'd got the patches out and documented things and made sure that everybody knew that that patch was available were all generally really pretty positive. And the thing which actually surprised me most, because as soon as this broke, I was thinking, oh crap, I'm in for it now. But in fact, I got no personal abuse at all. And that was really great. But also, I was slightly surprised that nobody contacted the project at all. Nobody actually asked, going, you know, what happened here? You know, why did this happen? And what did you do about it, kind of thing. Although they could have found out those things, they never actually went to the source and asked, which I kind of thought they might do. So what happened afterwards? By the point that we actually released this the second patch and got all that done, I was feeling kind of pretty drained and down about the whole thing. It had been quite intense, and it was like Christmas Eve. And having that public exploit really kind of, it was really unhelpful, and it denied us the ability to do a kind of a proper job the first time round. But having the patches released and all done did make me feel an awful lot better. But it occurred to me that this was a reasonably subtle bug, and so I wondered what other PHP email libraries had done about it. So I went and had a look, since they're all open, and was a little bit surprised to find that they hadn't. All of ZendMail, SwiftMailer, and Roundcube were vulnerable to exactly the same problem. And the same security researcher had been on all of them. And it just happened that we were the first to get the patch out. So that was good to see. I felt a lot better after that, thinking, it's not just me. And the other thing, of course, is got all the PHP, sort of anti-PHP people came out of the woodwork. But then I also found out that there had actually been similar bugs in Python, Ruby, and Node.js libraries, having exactly the same kind of problem. So at that point I was thinking, okay, that's really good. I'm not alone. Later on, the security researcher wrote quite a long article about the general vulnerability of PHP's mail function and all about the various different ways that you could exploit it. Because it's also by itself is possibly vulnerable to header injection as well, where you can do all sorts of weird stuff. Like, it's actually possible to embed a complete SMTP transaction inside a valid email address. That's quite a scary prospect. If you manage to make it break out of escaping at the right point, you can actually have it in the middle of sending one message, actually start a new SMTP session and send a different message just from the inside of the email address itself. This is crazy stuff. The RFCs around mail are just an absolute nightmare. There are hundreds of them, and they all overlap and conflict and tread on each other. And it's a bit of a nightmare. And this is why you really want to use a library of some kind, because they've been through the pain, and in PHPMailer's case, for many years. And there are all sorts of funny little corner cases to beware of. I've just run into one recently where Outlook.com has a problem with line lengths, and it messes up quoted printable encoding. And so you end up with a message with these sort of random equal signs appearing in it, if it doesn't like a particular line length. So I've been having to work around that. So, fundamental lessons really. Don't use mail. In fact, not only is email using the mail function quite dangerous, it's actually slower and less predictable and has less feedback than using SMTP to localhost. And for the most part, all that sendmail binaries do is they actually open a synchronous connection to localhost and talk SMTP over it and just give you the return code afterwards. So it's doing exactly the same thing, just giving you less feedback and adding more overhead. So just really don't use it. It's not a speed advantage to do it. If you read the postfix documentation, it has some notes on performance. It tells you various things, but one of the things it says is SMTP to localhost is the fastest way to submit to postfix. And weirdly, one of the first talks I did at a conference in about 2006 was titled, I can't remember the exact title, but it was called something like Staying Away from Mail. But that was largely not from a security point of view. It was the fact that mail was just too simple, and the chances of you actually constructing a message correctly and formatting your email addresses properly was actually pretty slim if you did it yourself, and that you should use a library to do it for you. The other thing was really, open source is awesome. It was just so cool having these people just turning up out of the blue and helping. And the fact that I could go and look at other solutions, and just the visibility of everything and the transparency, it was just such an excellent resource. I mean, although stuff had gone wrong in quite a bad way, but it was great that it was possible to actually even do that. I wasn't kind of stranded and isolated and with no information. And it was just so good having people turn up and help, because they were interested and engaged in admittedly their sort of point of view, which is from the kind of the security direction. But knowing that it's not all left up to you is a really kind of comforting thought. And this also led me to think that really, although I thought this anyway, this really brought it home. Security researchers and whistleblowers need effective legal protection as a matter of national policy, and it shouldn't be something that they should be able to override. But there have been so many examples like Snowden and so on, where they've done something which is really a public good and they're being punished for having done so. So with all this stress and so on, like, why be a maintainer? Why put yourself into this position? Well, when you've got something that's quite as public and popular as PHPMailer, there's a certain sense of professional pride in trying to do a job well without having a client breathing down your neck. But on the other hand, you're not being paid for it. It's often quite a drag to deal with the zillion duplicate bug reports of someone who can't even get as far as reading the README or even the error message right in front of them. I'm forever having things on Stack Overflow where people go, it's gone wrong and I have no idea what to do. And it has this error message with a link to a troubleshooting guide. And it's like, it's right there. you went to all the effort of signing up to Stack Overflow just to avoid clicking on one link. People do this kind of stuff all the time, and I get similar issues reported on GitHub. The vast majority of issues reported on GitHub are not bugs. They're how do I do this, or why doesn't this work? It's like, well, have you tried reading the README or basing your code on one of the examples? is the response to probably a good 75 to 80% of all the issues posted. However, it's not all bad stuff. When you do fix something for somebody, they're usually really grateful and really happy to have been helped. I've had so many people go, I owe you a pint, so somewhere I've got massive pint credit. But just in April, though, which was after all this had blown over, I got this email out of the blue. I was reminded of this again when, in Joe's opening keynote at the beginning of the conference here. He said that looking at GitHub wasn't like kind of reading a CV. But the thing is, in many ways, it is, as far as I'm concerned. You're kind of it's like your sort of the trail you leave behind you. It's like a shell history in a different context. And similarly, answering questions on Stack Overflow, you can tell if you read a lot of answers by the same person, you can get an idea of how they interact with other people and so on. So anyway, I got this email message completely out of the blue, which was just so nice. It was just such a lovely thing to receive. And the thing that made it even especially nice was that this was not in response to having fixed his problem. And if you find somebody online that's done something for you in a project, send them something saying thank you and that you appreciate it or whatever. It really makes you feel an awful lot better about it but when it comes to the time when you have to deal with all the stress and hassle of doing other maintaining stuff. So this comment about the light bulb was actually that somebody suggested a fix for an SMT problem, which amounted to not using SMTP. And so I likened this to saying that a broken light bulb only doesn't work when it's turned on. And that was what he thought was funny. But the thing is, this might come across as kind of ego stroking, but it's not really. It's just being nice to people, because effectively maintainers of open source software have effectively done you a favor. And it's just nice to say thank you every now and again. But it certainly helps to have a certain amount of cynicism to help you stay sane in the face of all these this sort of deluge of reports and so on. And adding links to documentation in your error messages is definitely a good way to go if you haven't done that already. Oh. So in the spirit of that, I really want to say thank you to David Golunsky of legalhackers.com, because he was the researcher that found the problems elsewhere, documented all the issues with mail, and was very helpful in the process. And in fact, I've seen him find all sorts of other stuff, so he clearly knows what he's doing. And also to the other people who commented or submitted patches, reviewed code, and particularly this guy, Paul Bueno-Pane, I'm not quite sure how you pronounce it, but he was kind of the locale and shell expert that really helped us get that in order. To start with, we were kind of looking at solutions which involved having a test case which tested every single possible character in this particular context. But then he pointed out that this wouldn't actually help, because what was going on inside mail was actually invisible and you couldn't tell whether it was actually going to work or not. So doing all that sort of rigorous testing in that particular circumstance wouldn't actually have helped. And all those other users who provide feedback and bug reports every day, not just on PHPMailer, but on every open source project. So that's the end of that from me. Any questions? Have I dropped you in it? Would any of you like to be in this position? Having to deal with a CVE? Have any of you been on the other end of a CVE like that? No?
Sometimes in the PHP project show
Yeah. Yeah. It's yeah, it can be quite stressful, I think. And if anyone wants to join in the project and help out, great. We need more test cases.
How much time was there between the 0 day and the batch? The second batch?
The time, well, I think we did it in a day. So,
The second batch also.
yeah. We really had to rush it out. But there was a certain amount of sort of panicking and all this flurry of discussion on the GitHub issues. I think it's all there. You can go look at it. There were also quite a lot of email conversations off GitHub as well. But
And are you aware of any attacks that use this vulnerability?
Well, there were a flurry of kind of follow-up things, particularly from things like WordPress and sort of frameworks and CMSs and so on that had PHPMailer embedded, rather than just linking to it outside. They all had to go and update their stuff. Things they weren't necessarily vulnerable because they were possibly doing one of the several things which would have meant that they wouldn't be vulnerable. For example, not putting the user-supplied content as the from address, which they shouldn't have been doing anyway. They may have been setting a sender address explicitly, which would have prevented the from address being copied into it. And also they may have been using SMTP anyway. It's really common for people to use SMTP, particularly if they're on shared hosting and things, where often they don't have the use of a local mail server. Or actually, traditionally, the part of the reason that PHPMailer became so popular initially is that it had an SMTP client of its own, and it meant then that it worked on Windows, where there wasn't a local mail server available typically. So just by using the SMTP client, the problem is bypassed, and you don't have any shells involved at all.
After this, do you change the way that you test or the workflow of doing this?
No, not really. You know, there's a thing, it needs fixing, you just release it like usually. You know, the actual thing that you had to do, you know, in many ways it's similar to any other bug. It's just its significance that was different. You know, technically speaking, you know, it's a few lines of code change and a commit and a push and a tag, and that's it. Nothing too different.
No, but what I mean is, like, do you create more test unit cases?
Oh, yes. Well, we try and make tests that cover any code that's changed, that accepts things. There was a saying, we tried making tests that were exhaustive, but it proved to actually be pointless. It didn't actually gain us anything. So.
I'm not sure if I understood you correctly, but did you say that you use the mail function by default?
Yes.
And why?
Because it's least effort. The code example, if I pop back to it, the code example, here. And that's fully functional code, really. Yeah, we've set a from address, set who it's going to, we set a body, and we sent it, and that's it. There's no other setup. Whereas if you use SMTP, you need to set a host, possibly a port, possibly the encryption setting, an ID and a password. So there's a whole load of extra settings that you have to have. And people often don't have it. The advantage of using mail is that because you're sending through the local mail server, you don't need any authentication, and you don't need to know what the host is because it's local. So it's just quicker and easier to use it like that. And there's a lot hidden by that send function. Like it builds the whole MIME structure and all the headers and everything, which is normally something that you would have to do yourself if you were calling mail manually. But yeah.
Yeah, I believe SwiftMailer, I think in their examples, they use SMTP by default.
Yeah, they may well do.
It might be because of the security.
Well, I know that you can use the mail function in SwiftMailer as well.
You
Yeah.
can, but I don't think the quick start uses it.
Yeah. I say it does involve more code. That's all. In fact, SwiftMailer released their patch after we did, and their patch was our patch. All they did is they just took the sort of the escaping test function that we did and just copied it completely. Sorry, Yoni was just telling me 5 minutes. Anyway, anyone else? No? Oh.
You said Microsoft Outlook has some strange edge cases.
Yeah.
But if they changed their code, so the edge cases disappear, how do you check it? Or do you leave it up to the community?
Just wait for someone to report it. The thing is, there are too many of those edge cases to cope with. One of the things that in the next release of PHPMailer, you'll notice this has a namespace. Ta-da! The thing is, the current version of PHPMailer actually supports PHP back to 5.0 because there are like a zillion people using it in old systems, whatever. But so there's a new version which requires PHP 5.5 as a minimum, and it has a namespace, and it gets rid of a whole load of excess junk that it's been bundled with. And I really need to get around to releasing it. But I did some good work on it this week, just at the hackathon a couple of days ago. Cleaned up the code. Managed to delete some more lines, which is always good. Anyway. Yeah, but the thing I was going to mention there, in the new version, it's got much better support for OAuth authentication, and one of the problems with that is that every single ISP is slightly different, and so you have to have a completely separate class for every different ISP. So plenty of scope for contributors there, but we're doing like Gmail, Yahoo, and Hotmail out of the box, I think. So that's the big ones covered. Anyway, that's all.